On the 8th of November 2001, Katherine Knight became the first and only woman in Australia to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She abused every single partner she ever had, both emotionally and physically, culminating in an attack on her husband that was so brutal it shocked the world and still does. Her crime was that grotesque that when she was sentenced, the judge said it was almost beyond contemplation in a civilized society. This is the case of Katherine Knight. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. Thanks for joining me today. I am going to cover a case that a lot of you asked for. It's one that is blindsidingly terrible and difficult to wrap your head around when you consider what actually plays out in this crime. If you know about the Katherine Knight case, and I hope that I'm going to give you some additional information, but if you don't, strap in. It's one of those that does leave you reeling and also just makes you think a little bit more deeply about the chasms of certain people's minds and the fractures in their foundations that could potentially exacerbate the behaviours that led to the horror that we're going to talk about right now. Also, if you're new to this channel, you just stumbled across it or it's been recommended, then my name's Emma Kenny and I do deep dive crime content on a Wednesday and a Sunday every single week. So if you like crime and consistency, this is definitely the channel for you. If you haven't subscribed, go on, do it now, immediately. Get your notifications on so you never miss an episode. Also, I'm going to be putting some extra content on my main YouTube channel. I'm also doing extra content for my YouTube community membership and also my Patreon. So if you have been so lovely and good as to support me, then you are going to be getting extra video content regularly because I want to say a massive thank you. Let's get on with today's case. So, who was that Katherine Knight? Well, she was born 24th of October 1955. She was born in a place called Tenterfield in New South Wales, Australia. I would say that her life was very challenging growing up. She was born and raised into a deeply unconventional, highly dysfunctional family and environment. So her mother, she was called Barbara Rowan. She'd actually been married to her husband, Jack, and she lived with him in a small town of Aberdeen in New South Wales, Hunter Valley. She had 4 sons before Barbara actually began an adulterous relationship with Ken Knight. Ken Knight was a friend, also a co-worker of her husband. And you got to think back to the days that these kind of affairs happened. It's not like now. It's not like these days when you have an affair and you can write an article on it in the Daily Mail or some large paper. That's not how things used to be. It used to be very much frowned on if you were in an adulterous relationship, particularly if you lived in a small community. It could be catastrophic for you, particularly if you were female. You were judged incredibly harshly. And the logistics of that meant that for Barbara and Ken, there was a huge backlash, and it was so big they had to move to Moray. Now, that in itself demonstrates that there would be a huge fracture within the family. None of the sons went with her, so the 2 eldest boys actually stayed with their father, and the 2 younger sons ended up being raised by an aunt in Sydney, which is really unusual as far as I'm concerned. When it comes down to the fact that you've made choices about who to have a sexual relationship with, obviously intimate partners are important, but your children should be a priority. And no matter how dysfunctional or difficult the relationship was with the ex-to-be, the reality is that those boys should have had some kind of good relationship with their mother. And I can't simply believe that it was simply down to her being considered so much of a pariah that she wasn't allowed to have any contact with those boys. I think it's probably choice-based as well to some degree. So there is a level of abandonment that we can see in that moment. Now, Barbara had 4 more children with Ken Knight, including twin girls in 1955. Katherine Knight was one of these, so she's a twin. So she's one of 8 children, which is obviously going to have a busy household reality. And even though obviously there were limited children who were actually with Barbara and with Ken, still it's a relatively busy household with 3 other siblings, and arguably when there's a level of dysfunction that we're seeing in this situation, I can imagine it would not be an ideal environment to be brought up in. So we get to 1959. This is when Katherine is 4 years of age. Jack Rowan actually died, and his 2 older sons at this point moved in with Barbara and Ken. So again, what are we seeing here? This transition. Suddenly the boys who've been absent from Barbara's life arrive back in it. There would obviously be a level of displacement, and there would be a problem with harmony because you're introducing them to an existing family. Yes, they are biologically related to Barbara, but there are other children, and we can imagine there would be some kind of rivalry at times. I don't think for 1 minute it would always be peaceful, because anybody who's lived in a family with step siblings will know it can be problematic and wonderful in equal measure. But Ken is a problem. So Ken Knight is not a very nice person. He's a very violent alcoholic, and on a sexual violation level, what he puts Barbara through is absolutely incomprehensible, because he would literally rape her up to 10 times a day. You can imagine how grotesque that would be as a partner, for Barbara to have no rights over her own body, and also to have this constant subjection to this violation would be psychologically incredibly distressing. But with Barbara, I almost believe and feel that she gets to a point of learned helplessness. And when you think back in time, domestic violence and domestic sexual violation wasn't even considered a crime. It was well known that men could beat their wives, and that was seen as a problem with the home and relationship. It wasn't a legal or criminal matter. And likewise, even when it came down to sexual violence, assault and rape, the truth is that the authorities wouldn't look at that as a crime, because there was some kind of intentional relationship there. You'd taken your vows till death do us part, in sickness and in health, for richer and for poorer, and so on and so forth. And therefore, even when a man was doing these reprehensible things to the female partner, he just wasn't considered a criminal. So she's at a point where there's no legal recourse for Barbara, and her body is no longer her own. And Barbara had poor boundaries, and I think we can absolutely empathise and sympathise with her horrific situation. She's in an awful place domestically. But as opposed to realising that what her children need is safety, she didn't honour that. So she would actually talk to her daughters about these horrible things that were happening to her in her sex life. She'd also tell her daughters that she hated sex, that she hated men. And for the developing child, and for some of you out there who've maybe had these scenarios where a parent doesn't understand important boundaries, it affects your perception of the world, and it also affects the perception that you have over these really important areas. Sex is something that we all are going to, on the whole, experience as we grow older, and we want to feel a connection of positivity with that act, not fear. And likewise, when we think about partners who are male, what we don't want to be doing is bringing children up with this identity and idea that all men are bad, because it's absolutely untrue and incongruent with reality. And what you're going to do is you're going to form expectations for those kids growing up that are negative. And if you're giving out negative expectations, then often you'll receive that negativity in return, because we create the things that we believe. And she's bringing her kids up with these ideas. Now, later down the line, when actual Katherine Knight herself complains to her mother that one of her partners wanted her to take part in a sex act that she really didn't want to take part in, Barbara said to her, put up with it and stop complaining. Now, again, that is reprehensible as a parent. You don't say that to your children. You certainly should absolutely 100% feel that your main duty and prerogative is to protect your child. But this is a sign of the times. And also, like I said, Personally, I believe there's a sign of learned helplessness. There's nothing she can do about it. She may as well accept it. And therefore, when a daughter is asking her about a situation where she wants to protect herself, Barbara simply says what she's done. She's put up with it. She hasn't complained about it. That's the best thing. Head down, get on with it, which is terrible advice. But like I said, it makes sense when you look at what Barbara was dealing with. Also, Katherine Knight's parents would routinely beat her and beat them with things like leashes and electrical cords. She wasn't the only person in the family who got beaten up. Her siblings also were beaten up, but quite high level abuse. And Katherine Knight also said an additional issue for her living at home was that she was constantly sexually assaulted by several of her older brothers. She wasn't ever sexually violated by her father, but obviously if in that home there is this really inappropriate sexual behaviour occurring by her father to her mother, you can understand that that breaches certain boundaries, and there can be a consequence of that, which is the way that the young men in the family believe a woman should be treated. And so Katherine is essentially a victim of that thing playing out and that situation unfolding. And for any child to be sexually molested by siblings, it is absolutely devastating. And I can imagine that a developing Katherine Knight feels desolate because she has so little control over her world. And whilst none of this is going to excuse the behaviour that we talk about down the line, I think it's really important to look at the variables of influence and the activation factors that lead to totally reprehensible behaviour and actions down the line. We have to understand that, because if we can understand it, then perchance when we are met with situations where young people are struggling in circumstances like this, they can be helped and therefore overcome some of the horrible impact that these things have created for them in their life. Now, there are doubts about details because obviously Katherine Knight is someone that a lot of people don't believe on lots of levels because of her actions. But what I will tell you is that psychiatrists do genuinely, on the whole, accept her claims, and also for much of the time that she's discussed what she said she endured at her family's hands, it has been confirmed by family members. So she certainly, it seems, was somebody who was horribly violated in the way that I've just described. Now, another issue at the time for this family was Barbara's great-grandmother. So Barbara's great-grandmother was an Indigenous Australian from the Maori area, and she'd actually married an Irish man. Now, Barbara, Katherine Knight's mother, was really proud of this, and she identified as Aboriginal. But this was actually kept as a family secret. There was so much racism in the area that they were growing up at the time that people were afraid, on the whole, to admit that they were Aboriginal. So what happened was the tension in the family was always there. The kids were scared that Barbara, who was proud, and rightfully so, of her great-grandmother's heritage, was going to expose them. And the problem would be that they could endure obvious alienation, but also things like violence, because there was so much hatred projected towards these individuals, which is ironic when you consider the fact that, obviously, Aboriginal people were the rightful individuals in Australia. But, like I said, we're going back a long time, and the world was certainly not the world that we know today. Now, apart from Katherine's twin sister, the only other person that Katherine Knight was actually close to was her uncle. He was called Oscar Knight. He was a champion horse rider. And what was really traumatic for Katherine Knight was that he actually killed himself. He died by suicide in 1969. And she still maintains to this day that his ghost visits her. And there are two ways of looking at that. First of all, psychologically, when you go through a traumatic loss, your brain has to manage the overwhelming pain that you endure. And so for some people, it can almost create a break from reality, a compartmentalization, shall we say, where you cope in a way that's not necessarily typical as far as others are concerned. So it could be that Knight decides that she needs to still have this relationship with this dead party, and therefore she has these delusions to some degree, these visions, other people would call it, where she genuinely does believe that he is visiting her. Other people would say, well, no, Emma, maybe he does genuinely still have a relationship with her and he comes to her from the afterlife. But either way, what we're certainly seeing is a lack of acceptance about his death. And this is not uncommon where traumatic loss occurs, and there is nothing apart from murder that is as traumatic as death by suicide. So that's going to have a massive impact on her. This guy is a safe place, a safe space, somebody that she really connects with, and he's gone. And not just he's gone, it's an abandonment of the highest level. When somebody takes their own life, even though you have total empathy and sympathy with why they may have done that, the feeling is still the same. The feeling is you chose to leave me, and that can give you real issues around your self-worth. And she's already got these fractured connections towards men because her father's incredibly violent, her brothers are incredibly abusive. So the consequence is the one sure person in your life chooses not to be present anymore. It's going to exacerbate those fractures in your foundation. We get to 1969 and they actually move back to Aberdeen at this point as a family. And Katherine Knight ends up attending Muswellbrook High School. Now, what people said about Katherine Knight at school is that she was a real loner. And when she is remembered by her peers, by her classmates, she was remembered as a bully and somebody who really liked to be domineering over smaller kids. Now, that in itself demonstrates probably a desire for Knight to actually have some control and power and self-determination over her environment. She's doing it in a horrible way, but bear in mind, this is a young girl who at home is getting horribly molested. She's witnessing her mother being beaten by her father. She's aware of the sexual violations that are playing out in her own family, both towards herself by her brothers and towards her mother by her father. So it does make sense to some degree that she is looking for an outlet to have a level of control, but she does it in the most horrific of ways. And I feel like this is where she starts to learn her craft as a child. That yes, in the home, she has little control, little power, but outside of that home, she can utilize physical violence over people who are more vulnerable or less inclined to retaliate, to actually hold court in that physical way. One memory that people have about Knight in school is that she actually assaulted a boy in school with a weapon. So we're not talking about a kid who's bullying individuals with their hands, with their words. We're talking about people who are willing to go to school and actually utilize a weapon to assault another boy, and that's really disturbing. She also once injured a teacher, so she has an issue with authority, and clearly boundaries are something that she doesn't feel the need to uphold. And again, when you're seeing that kind of psychology and that kind of mentality, the reason that it is concerning is most of us have areas of our brain. So the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, for example, is meant to communicate effectively with the amygdala. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex would be the area that's about empathy and guilt. So really important. I need to know how you feel, or at least imagine how you feel so that I can relate to you. Also, it's really important for building bonds. And guilt, so powerful, so important. Because if I feel guilty, it's going to motivate me not to do something again. And that needs to communicate with the area of the brain that's more instinctual, the fight, flight, freeze area. Some people say primordial brain, some people say amphibian brain. If you just think about the instinct brain, that area is responsible for things like mediating anxiety and fear. Again, they need to communicate effectively with one another so that you have a level of pro-social behavior. If you don't have that connection, communicating effectively, then you are going to breach boundaries. It's going to affect your emotional and social regulation and behavior. And if you're attacking a teacher, then arguably you don't have respect of authority, you don't have a level of impulse control, you're not a consequential thinker, and they are problematic deeply within behavior because it means that you will not toe the line, you will not follow the rules, and you don't even necessarily believe that rules apply to you, and your own needs, even if that's an impulsive, spontaneous need, is so difficult for you to manage that you will act out even if the consequences of those actions are catastrophic, both for you and for others. So she did have some clear anger issues. I will also note, just to address balance, that other people said she was a model student. Other people said that she actually earned awards for good behaviour. I think that we all know that difficult children can often be given a lot of praise when they are doing a good job because teachers want to motivate them and maintain positive behaviour. So it could be that those memories are absolutely correct, that on both levels, she was a problem, she was dysfunctional, she was a bully, she was aggressive, she used violence physically to affect whatever she needed to change or to gain. And at the same time, there were moments where she was doing really well, and that was validated and represented by teachers praising her and giving her awards for good behaviour. She ends up leaving school at 15. As much as people have said that she was a really good student, a model student, well, she left school without actually learning how to read and write. So I would again suggest that the memories about her being a model student are probably inaccurate. I think it's probably more likely than what I just said is a representation of how she was, because it's not to do with her not being an intelligent individual. She's intelligent enough. It's just that she hasn't committed to learning. So once she's left, she actually gains employment in a clothing factory. But she actually leaves this job just 12 months later to start, I kid you not, what she calls her dream job, which is cutting offal at the local abattoir. Just gonna take a moment to pause there, because I did actually say that sentence. She left the job in the clothing factory after 12 months because she found her dream job, cutting offal at the local abattoir. If you were to suggest my worst nightmare of a job, the job that would mean I was persistently depressed and actually terrified of returning to work, it would be the job I've just described. I cannot imagine what it would be like being surrounded by carcasses of once sentient beings. It would send me under, but not Katherine Knight. No, Katherine Knight's like, you know what I need? I need a job surrounded by death. That's what I need. I need to be basically in a place where the stench of fear and corpses just are the natural aroma. Ode to death. Ode to death. That's what I'm going for. And that's what I feel my achievements in life are going to be based on. This literally is real. This is what she thought. And she did really well because it's her dream job. And I'm imagining that a lot of the people who are in that job are not thinking, this is what I wake up in the morning to just connect with and do. This is what makes me thrive. Most are probably just doing a job because they have to. They're probably more in my camp when it comes down to their feelings. But of course, Katherine Knight is just having the time of her life. She's literally in the place that she feels that she connects with most effectively. So she gets quickly promoted to boning. Even saying that word makes me shiver. So obviously now she's going to bone the animals, and at this point she's given her own set of butcher's knives, which we all can imagine are incredibly dangerous. And in fact, the type of person I don't really want having their own legal set of incredibly sharp, incredibly terrifying butcher's knives would be somebody with a propensity for violence and low impulse control. But they obviously didn't get the memo on that. After all, they've got Katherine Knight working for them now, a woman who's literally set her store at this place, this environment, this position, being her very thing of dreams. That again worries me. If I was talking to somebody and they were like, you know what I love? I love boning carcasses, love it. Deconstructing bodies, it makes me happy. I would be going, I'm just going to move from the area because you know my address and I'm not comfortable with this. Anyway, this is what happens, and at home she's so proud of these knives that she hangs them over her bed so they would always be handy if I needed them. Direct quote from her, by the way. Always be handy if I needed them. Just going to throw it out there, Katherine Knight. Why over your bed? Because I'm imagining the abattoir with the dead animals and you boning them because that needs to happen for the cuts of meat. I'm imagining you would probably hang them there, but you're choosing to hang them over your bed where intimacy is meant to take place. Yeah, but probably that's where I'm going to need them more than anything. But that could involve you doing harm to another human. Yeah, that's over my bed, intimate space. Cross me, I'll bone you. Sounded inappropriate then, when you think about intimacy. Bone isn't an appropriate word that's used to describe, shall we say, intimate acts. Nonetheless, I digress. The point is that it's not typical behaviour. And again, I understand that one could argue, well, this is as a reaction directly to her experience as a child, feeling powerless, being abused, sex being seen as a real shadow in her world, something that is unsafe. And therefore, it's a message to any man who comes into her room: you put a foot wrong, there will be consequences. You harm me, there will be consequences. And that projection of powerlessness now being placed in the protective mechanism the knives offer her. So I understand the imagery, but it still doesn't sit well when you consider what this could articulate on an emotional level regarding her propensity for violent behaviour. So we know that Katherine Knight has got issues with men because of the way that she's been treated by them, the way her mother's basically indoctrinated her to believe how terrible they are. And when you think about her meeting potential partners, she's carrying this enormous amount of emotional, psychological damage. And again, that means that the men that she's going to connect with potentially could at points find themselves in very dangerous territory. As Katherine Knight settled into her work at the abattoir, she meets a man called David Kellett. Now, they meet in 1973. One of the things that's problematic with David Kellett is he's a heavy drinker. And the reason that he was a heavy drinker, we can feel absolute sympathy and empathy with, because he had two really highly traumatic incidents. He'd been working previously in a railway job in Coffs Harbour, and his best friend was killed in front of him. It was in a shunting accident, so that's when they're changing over the train carriages, and he actually witnessed that, a best friend dying. So he'd have had survivor guilt, and also the horrible images that would be scorched into his mind because of what he'd seen. And then later, he was a hero, and he actually rescued injured occupants of a school bus in Kempsey. It had been struck by a train, but during that rescue mission, it had also been noted that 6 children had been killed. And you can't imagine the feeling that somebody would have knowing that children had died and that they couldn't save them. So it makes perfect sense that he's trying to anesthetize those feelings and self-medicate with alcohol. But the problem is, because he's drinking heavily, he loses his job. You know, his behaviour deteriorates, so he can't stay at the railways. That means that he needs to work, and he ends up finding a job at the nearby Aberdeen abattoir. This is when he actually becomes friends with Katherine Knight's brother, and that's how they meet. Also, I feel that validates what I said about most people who get a job at the abattoir. It's not first on the list unless it's Katherine Knight. And there is a really intriguing behaviour of Katherine Knight around Kellett, because Kellett drinks a lot. So sometimes he gets into altercations, shall we say. And if he did get into an altercation, Katherine Knight would literally step in and back him up by fighting. I mean, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say it's highly unusual for a woman to do that. Yes, we see on occasion men getting into physical altercations, but what we tend not to see is somebody that they're mates with who are female getting involved and seemingly enjoying the violence that they encounter. But this is Katherine Knight. So obviously there's a loyalty that she shows him, but at the same time, I genuinely think that there's a level of enjoyment about fighting with men. She was also very well known locally for being incredibly physically threatening to anyone who upset her. So we've got that continuation from her schooling days all the way through to adulthood, which is that she's not afraid to retaliate or react if you cross her. So Knight and Kellett end up getting together, and then in 1974, which isn't long after they meet, at her request as well, they end up getting married. What's interesting about the scene when they get married is that for most of us, I'm just going to throw it out there, you arrive usually looking relatively nice because, you know, it's your big day. Hopefully it's only going to happen once, and therefore there's going to be a little bit of an effort. You know, you're going to be thinking to yourself, got to impress the in-laws, need to make just that little bit more of a effort to produce an outfit that makes me look like, I don't know, I actually think I am getting married and I'm about to commit my life to this individual. Not quite where Knight and Kellett were that day. So they turned up. She was riding a motorcycle with him on the back, and they were both really drunk. So that started off really well. If ever I go to a wedding, I'm always looking for that kind of connection and commitment that makes me feel this is going to work out. It's going to work out. It's going to work out. And if you turn up drunk on a motorbike, I'm like, these two have got it nailed down. It's exactly how a relationship should start when it comes down to committing the rest of your life to somebody. And as the couple were taking their happy nuptials, shall we say, one of the pieces of advice that was given was by Barbara to David Kellett, so Katherine Knight's mother. She had wise words. She was a bit of a soothsayer. Some would say shamanic in her approach, a little bit like Gandhi. And this was her advice. She said, watch out with this one, or she'll fucking kill you. Stir her up the wrong way or do the wrong thing and you're fucked. Don't ever think about playing up on her. She'll fucking kill you. And that was literally her mother telling David Kellett what to do in the relationship. So basically, if you cheat on her, she'll kill you. If you say anything wrong, you're going to be in for a beating potentially. And just remember, if you have constantly in the back of your mind, if you do anything that she doesn't like, you're dead, and avoid doing that, it will all be fine. That in itself is harrowing. She also apparently told David Kellett that Katherine Knight had got something loose. She said that she got a screw loose somewhere. Now, it could be that Barbara Knight is a little bit of a psychic, or it could be that Barbara Knight had simply lived with Katherine and therefore knew the propensity that she had for being, shall we say, a little bit aggressive if she didn't get her own way. So on her wedding night, Katherine Knight tried to strangle Kellett. That actually happened. Apparently, the reason and motivation for her trying to murder him on their wedding night was because he fell asleep after only having intercourse 3 times. 3 times. Immediately, I know that most of us are taking a sharp intake of breath because, first of all, even the most average wedding is a bit exhausting. Usually, you've had a little bit too much to drink. Often, if I'm involved, I've had too much to eat. And I don't know, you just want to sleep it off, don't you? And if on your wedding night you have an opportunity to be intimate and consummate the wedding, great. But I think once is absolutely enough, with respect. Expecting that another 2 times, I think is a little bit on the excessive side. I mean, great if you can manage it. But to then think, well, this person has only managed to copulate with me on 3 occasions, therefore, as they have failed on their 4th or 5th attempt, I'm going to strangle them, seems a little bit on the, I don't know, overreactionary scale. But like I said, we're not dealing with the typical human being where Katherine Knight is concerned. You will understand that this start to the marriage kind of suggested things weren't going to work out. So it was a really violent marriage. And on one occasion, and this is when Katherine Knight is heavily pregnant, she burned all of Kellett's clothing. She burned his shoes. She also, if that wasn't enough, hit him across the head with a frying pan because he'd arrived home late from a darts competition. And he'd actually arrived late from a darts competition because he'd reached the finals. So one would usually imagine, I don't know, a pat on the back, a well done, darling, I'm very proud of you for being that good at darts, but not for Katherine Knight. It was something that meant that she was absolutely incandescent with rage because he breached her boundaries that are completely inflexible, but also have consequences that are dire. Kellett, understandably, saw this as a high-level attack. He was terrified. He was in fear of his life. So he actually managed to flee the home and he collapsed in his neighbour's house. And when they took him to hospital, he had to be treated for a very severely fractured skull. So she could have killed him. You think about a bleed on the brain being caught from such a blunt force trauma. This would be something that isn't uncommon. It's what we see happens in murder cases. The police are flabbergasted by the violence, and their advice is very clear to Kellett. They want to charge Knight, but she has the ability to be relatively manipulative, and she also acts like she's the victim in this situation, so she manages to convince Kellett to drop the charges, and we see this a great deal in domestic abuse cases, whether that's male to female or female to male, because you are in love with the person or are in fear of the person, it's quite easy for that individual to lord their power or manipulate you because of your emotional connection with them to act in a way that goes against your own safety but protects theirs. And she manages to do that. And it's really sad because this is why so many people end up in domestic homicide situations. They genuinely believe that the person will never actually kill them, and then they absolutely do, because the only care and consideration the abuser has is for themselves. And if you cross them to a point where they feel that you no longer have a right to the life that you lead, then they'll steal it without a second thought. We get to May 1976. So this is just shortly after the birth of the very first child, Melissa Ann. Kellett actually leaves Knight, and he does this because he's met somebody else, which I would say is incredibly dangerous for him. And also, did you not listen to what Barbara Knight suggested? I think she did suggest that she would have you killed or kill you if you were to betray her. But also, you can imagine that Kellett is desperate to have a relationship with somebody who's more well-adjusted and doesn't terrify him. So he ends up moving to Queensland. The next day, Katherine Knight is actually witnessed pushing her new baby in a pram down a main street, but she's violently throwing the pram from side to side. So immediately people can see this is somebody who is not in her right mind. She's very angry, she's chaotic, she's not acting in a way that would be expected with a newborn who's obviously clearly vulnerable. So she ends up getting admitted to St Elmo's Hospital, that's in Tamworth. And at this point, they diagnose her with postnatal depression. She ends up spending several weeks in St Elmo's Hospital being treated for this. When she's released, Knight doesn't seem to have changed. If anything, she seems worse. So she takes her 2-month-old daughter, Melissa, who she's already been seen essentially being abusive to by violently throwing her pram around, but she takes that beautiful little 2-month-old baby onto the railway line shortly before the train's due, leaves the baby on the railway line. And then after she's done this, after she's willingly and knowingly left that baby in dire straits with her life fully at risk, she steals an axe, goes into town, and then threatens to kill several people. In fact, if it hadn't been for a homeless man who had known in the district as Old Ted, if it hadn't been for him foraging near the railway line, he actually saw Melissa on the railway line, he found her, he rescued her, but if he hadn't done that, she would have been killed. It was minutes before the train passed, so you can know that Katherine Knight had a full intention for her daughter to come to harm. Now, I do appreciate when you think about psychotic issues where new mothers are concerned, we can have, without a doubt, postnatal psychosis. It happens where an individual loses their mind to some degree, has psychotic breaks, and at times, unfortunately, does some really horrible things to themselves or to their child. This does happen. But we have to remember, Knight had got out of hospital. How had she manipulated and fooled those individuals to actually believe that she was in a position where she was well enough to leave? One could argue, well, maybe they just did a really bad job. Maybe they babysat her for a few weeks and then said she was ready to go home. But you can't help but imagine that it was more likely that Katherine Knight was able to be relatively manipulative and seem as if she was okay, and was pumping herself with rage about what had happened to lead her into the situation where she was in hospital, where her partner had left her for another woman, where all of those things that fuels the fire within her was burning so brightly that she tempered her reality and behaviour so that she was seen as okay by the staff around her. Then as soon as she walks out of that door, she actually allows all those feelings to erupt, and the consequence of that is threatening to kill other people and almost killing her own baby. So at this point, she's now made threats to kill other people, she's put her child in imminent danger, and Knight ends up getting arrested. She's taken back to St Elmo's Hospital, but apparently she recovered, and then she signs herself out the following day. I do not know how that works, genuinely. In the UK, if you're in a situation where you've just done what I've said you've done, I doubt you'd even be able to be put into hospital as a voluntary individual, signing yourself in for mental health help. Because even when you're voluntary in the UK and you go into a mental health ward, that doesn't mean you can leave. The reality is, if they don't feel you are safe, they can then decide to commit you. And you would imagine what I've just described would certainly mean that she was somebody who met the bar to be put into hospital against her will and kept there until they believed that she was safe. But no, she signs herself out the following day, just after nearly murdering her daughter and threatening to murder other people. And that means that she hasn't had any severe consequences at this point. And then a few days, and I mean just literally a few days later, Katherine Knight slashes the face of a woman with one of those knives that she loves to hold over a bed. And she actually demanded that this woman drives her to Queensland to find her ex-partner, Kellett. So she is a woman possessed. This poor individual that she's attacked physically does manage to escape. So they stop at a service station and she just legs it. And by the time that the police actually get to the service station, Knight has decided that the best way to manage this is to take a young boy hostage. So she's threatening this poor boy with a knife. And she gets disarmed when the police basically struggle with her. And then she's actually admitted to Morisset Psychiatric Hospital. So finally, to some degree, the authorities are taking it more seriously, because she's obviously now doing things that high-level offenders who are very violent do, and she's a danger to other people. And when she's admitted, Knight actually tells the nurse that she intended to kill the mechanic at the service station because he had repaired Kellett's car. I kid you not. So just run that by me again, Katherine Knight. Well, I decided that I was going to kill the mechanic. Why would you kill the mechanic? Do you know the mechanic? No, I don't know the mechanic, but he's a mechanic and he fixed a car. That's what mechanics do. Yes, but he fixed a car that my ex drove out of the area, and now he's escaped from me with my big knives to go and be with another woman. So I want him dead. I'm struggling with this because that's a bit like saying that you want to kill the guy at the co-op shop for selling your husband a pasty because he's not going to die of starvation now. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. You're bloody right. I'm going to go and kill him too. Sorry about the accent. I've no idea why I did that. But I started and I was like, I've committed to this now. So I'm just gonna carry it on. I'm just gonna go through with it. I apologise in advance to anybody who lives in Australia or New Zealand, because it could have been a terrible New Zealand accent as well. But that's her logic, that Kellett's car's been fixed by this mechanic, therefore the mechanic is absolutely complicit in her life falling apart. So when the police inform Kellett himself, you know, that there's a strong possibility this woman wants you dead, as opposed to him reacting as I would have, I don't know, saying, could you please immediately put me in witness protection because I think she means business. He actually does something that I would say is incredibly kind, if not a little bit silly, when you think about how domestically abused he's been, because he leaves his girlfriend and he moves to Aberdeen with his mother to support Knight. And I guess part of that motivation would be because of the child, and he's thinking to himself that the child is in danger. But he genuinely is placing himself in imminent danger in that moment in time. We get to the 9th of August 1976. Katherine Knight at this point is released into the care of her mother-in-law, and along with her now returned husband Kellett, they move to Ipswich in Brisbane, and she actually gets a job at Dinmore Meatworks. So again, following that trajectory, she likes to be amongst death and carcasses. Then on the 6th of March 1980, she has another daughter, that's Natasha Marie. And then in 1984, I would imagine Kellett feels a level of relief at this point. She leaves him. She moves to her parents' house in Aberdeen, and then she moves to a rented house in nearby Muswell Brook. She then returns back to the job at the abattoir. I bet they were thrilled to have her back. It's got Katherine Knight coming back. Katherine Knight, she's the really scary one. She's scary, but let me tell you, we have never in our entire experience working here had an individual as committed or happy to be in this environment. That's why I'm a little little bit scared. Did you hear what she said she was going to do to the guy at the mechanics? And apparently she went on to want to kill most of the people working in the industries that were serving Keller in any way, shape or form, including the shopkeeper, the greengrocer, and the person down at the local leisure centre who let him swim because exercise can be good for your health. Anyway, this is what happens. She goes back. But unfortunately for Katherine Knight, she ends up injuring her back the following year and she ends up going on a disability pension. But again, that means that she's going to be financially looked after. And I'm sure that even though the injury is upsetting for her, she doesn't have to worry necessarily about money. But also, because she hasn't got the distraction of work and the motivation that it creates for a lot of us. You know, we go to work, we have engagements with colleagues, it gives us a deflection from our real life. This gives more of an intensity to her personal life because she doesn't have the professional life available to her anymore. Now, she doesn't need to rent a house close to work at this point, of course, because she's no longer working. And the government actually give her a housing commission residence in Aberdeen. So she has a place to live, she has money coming in, and she doesn't have to worry that much about her future. It's taken care of to some degree. It wouldn't have been a very luxurious life, but like I said, economically, she was looked after. Now, another relationship that Katherine Knight got involved in, as if that was a good idea. Katherine, I think maybe just taking time out and working on yourself would probably be a better thing for you to concentrate on. No? Okay, you're just going to move on and be equally as reprehensible, if not worse, to other people. Okay, let's do that. So she meets 38-year-old miner David Saunders in 1986. And actually, it's just a few months later that he moves in with her and her daughters. He does keep his old flat too, but that's the intensity issue, isn't it? And I always think that even though there's that intoxicating experience psychologically when you connect with somebody new, we all have been there. It's really easy to judge people who rush into things, but you fall hard very often for a new person in your life and you imagine that they're every answer to every prayer that you've had. And it's really easy for people to behave early on. And Katherine Knight, we've seen, think about the hospital and the fact that they let her out very quickly. She's obviously very capable at seeming to be okay. She was successful in work, so she can maintain boundaries when it's required and when it's necessary. But in relationships, she probably can quite easily seem like the best daydream possible for these individuals until she falls into the nightmare that she actually is. So her jealousy is there from the get-go where Saunders is concerned. So she's very angry whenever he's elsewhere. She gets upset when he isn't around. And she was somebody who would throw him out regularly because he was somebody who wanted to maintain opportunities that were outside of their relationship, have friendships, do his own thing, and this was not seen as acceptable. Knight was incredibly upset when he wanted to spend time anywhere else. So he would actually move back to his flat, try to get some space from her, which is the right thing to do, and she would just follow him. She would beg him to return. She'd promise that everything was going to be all right if he just came back, and often he would go back because he wanted to believe that she was the initial daydream he believed that she was. But in May 1987, Katherine Knight literally gets this 2-month-old dingo pup that he's got, and she cuts its throat in front of him. And the reason that she did that was she wanted to example exactly what would happen if he ever dared to cross her. Now, first of all, the level of trauma associated with watching a puppy that you adore, because that's what happens. If you've got a 2-month-old puppy, you are absolutely connected to it. It doesn't matter whether you've had them 2 days or 2 weeks or 2 years. They are your ward. You care for them. The fact that she just slices its throat of this innocent being, first of all, I mean, immediately that's a red flag. I know she's been working in an abattoir. I know that she's an old hand at boning animals. But the point is that this is a pet. And a pet is a family connection. And she's letting him know that she has no care or consequence for that, either for the sentient being that she's murdered or for the way that he feels about losing a member of his family, albeit an animal family. That message, that sinister message that's being expressed, which is, if you dare to do anything like cheat on me, this is what's going to happen to you. And even worse, after she's done that, so she's assaulted him in a violent way by showing him that image and stealing this puppy from him, she then knocks him unconscious with a frying pan. So very much like what happened with Kellett. She knows the injuries that she caused Kellett, but she does it again to this new love interest, and that in itself demonstrates that she has a deep level of malevolence, an impossible level of anger that people will not be able to expect, and it comes out of nowhere and literally knocks him out both emotionally but obviously physically in this case as well. We get to June 1988. She gives birth to her third daughter at this point. This is Sarah. You kind of think to yourself, should she have been allowed to have any other children in her care? I mean, what she did to her daughter, taking her to the train tracks and leaving her there to die, that to me says that this woman is not safe to be around, let alone all the additional things that I've talked about so far, which makes her an incredibly terrifying person on a physical level to be around children and to be around people per se. She nonetheless has this child, and at this point Saunders feels, because now he's got a kid with her, that it's time to put a deposit on a house. Now, Knight pays off that deposit when she gets her workers' compensation in 1989. So as far as she's concerned, this is her home. She has contributed towards it, and she will have a territory and ownership over that. Now, when it came down to decor, Knight wasn't, shall we say, a traditionalist. She wasn't thinking, oh, should I go for the Laura Ashley wallpaper? Or what's Lawrence Llewellyn Bowen doing with his interior design right now? No, she wasn't of that school of thought. She was like, well, I could go for a floral or chintz, maybe. In light of my working at the abattoir, I could think about a nice leather suite. No, not for her. Knight instead thought, you know what we're going to go for? We're going to go for an animal theme, but not in the, oh, there's a picture of a puppy. Oh, I like those cushions. They remind me of soft, cuddly cats. No, she was more of a animal skins. Yeah, just throw a few pelts around here. Also skulls. I mean, I don't know about you, but coming home is like coming home to an empty house if I don't have the odd skull to make it feel like it's all lovely and cozy. She had horns. Rusty animal traps. I mean, if you haven't got a rusty animal trap in your kitchen whilst you're preparing Sunday lunch, I don't know what you're doing with your kitchen or your Sunday lunch in that reality. So she would have machetes, rakes, just a whole heap of hoarding in the most macabre of ways possible. Apparently there was literally no space left untouched. So the ceilings, they were all covered, literally every space. Imagine going for dinner at the house of the individual who was at the heart of the chainsaw massacre movies. That kind of thing. You know, can you imagine visiting? I mean, where was social services? Just walking in, just come to see your baby. Oh, now where is my baby? I know my baby is somewhere. By the way, if you can hear the muttering that's going on in the background, that's my baby, who is just coming up to 5 weeks old, and she's incredibly vocal. She's wonderful. She's very vocal. But my baby is in a comfortable bed next to me, so I can, you know, be a mother, keep an eye on her, make sure that she's safe. Whereas if you were social service and you went round to Katherine Knight's home, you'd be like, where's the baby? And she'd be like, oh, where is the baby? Oh, hang on. Looking at the bear trap that's now inhabited by a small child, perchance. But this just demonstrates how she was left to her own devices, and she shouldn't have been, because the propensity that we're looking at for this woman where violence is concerned is deeply disturbing and incredibly dangerous. Apparently, when she and Saunders would argue, he wasn't violent towards her, but she was incredibly violent towards him. She'd hit him in the face with an iron. She'd stabbed him in the abdomen with a pair of scissors. These are things that can cause death. So when she attacks, she's not attacking because she's in a rage and she's losing it. She's not flying off the handle in a way where she isn't to some degree in control. She knows what she's doing. She's seen the impact of her actions before. So yes, she struggles to maintain composure, but that is very different from actually physically stabbing someone with scissors, because you know that can kill them. Hitting them with an iron, you know that can kill them. She's picking her implements very specifically. They are incredibly dangerous and they can cause instant death for the individual who's attacked by them. But she has no boundaries, even with people that she's meant to care for. So he moves back to his own flat because he obviously thinks he's safe there. And then when he finally moves back to Aberdeen, he finds that she's cut up all his clothes. So again, there's that, if you do A, this will be the consequence B. In this case, physical violence or you losing your possessions. He ends up taking long service leave from work and he goes into hiding because he's absolutely terrified of Katherine Knight. Of course, this doesn't deter her. She tries to find him, but she is actually unsuccessful at managing to locate where he is. But this man has purposefully and willfully disappeared, both from the local area and from Katherine Knight, because he's terrified for his life. That demonstrates that he's got a level of protection over himself. He's terrified about the consequences of her actions, and he knows that the potential she has to cause him serious or fatal injury is absolutely real enough to disappear. Now, several months later, he ends up coming back, and the reason for that is he wants to see his daughter. He's afraid for his daughter. And he actually finds out that Katherine Knight has been to the police and said that she's scared of him. So she's used that gender bias against him, because very often people struggle to understand that men can be violently affected in relationships. They can be the victims. Certainly at the time period we're talking about, the police would have found it far more palatable to believe that a woman was being abused than the man in the relationship. And they actually issued an apprehended violence order against him. So he becomes the victim of circumstance, the victim of bias, the victim of abuse, and now a restraint, essentially, against even seeing her. So she's highly manipulative. Now, she moves on from this relationship and she meets John Chillingworth. This is in 1991. She actually becomes pregnant by him. He's 43 years old at the time. He's, again, former abattoir co-worker. She gives birth to the child, 1992, and this is a child that she names Eric. The relationship that she has with this man, it lasts 3 years, but then she leaves him. She leaves him for a guy called John Price, which is really interesting because she's done this several times. And so the rules that she applies in expectation to her partners are not the rules that she applies to her own behaviour. We have seen her leaving relationships for other men, cheating on her partners with other men, and yet she doesn't seem to feel that she's guilty of anything. But if they even so much as suggest that they might leave her for somebody else, she says that she's going to kill them. So, like I said, a very warped behaviour pattern where she expects of others far more than she expects of herself. And she'd been having an affair with this particular guy, John Price, for quite a long time. So John Price, the guy that she leaves for, who she's been having this affair with, he worked in local mines. He was the father of 3 children. This is when Knight actually started the affair with him. People who knew John Price, they said, he was a really terrific bloke. Everybody who knew him liked him. He was a really warm individual. I'm sure that was the allure towards him. I'm sure that Katherine Knight liked the fact that people found him such a lovely human being to be around. I guess if you're a really nice person, maybe it's easy to manipulate you at times. You see the best in people, not the worst in people. So that would put him in the back foot with this relationship. Also, she's had an affair with him for a long period of time, and there haven't been too many red flags in that affair. So he probably thinks that she's either changed around him, at least, or that she's changed as a person, or he's been unaware of just how violent she's been in other relationships. Now, John Price was an individual who was already a father, so he was a father of 3 when he and Knight had an affair. He was, according to everybody around him, just a really terrific, good bloke, liked by everybody who knew him. He had been married before. That marriage had ended in 1988, and his 2-year-old daughter had stayed with his ex-wife, but the older children, they'd moved in with him. And again, shows that he's responsible, shows that he prioritises his kids. I would say his main failure in this situation is that he knows how violent Katherine's past has been. He knows that she has a horrendous reputation, and yet he lets her move into his house in 1995, which is a really bad move. It's always one of those things that I have total understanding and empathy for. When you meet an individual who's been abusive in the past, it's very easy for you to believe it will be different with you. Those of you who've had relationships with violent people, who have prior to your relationship been violent with partners, what they tend to do is they spread a web of lies where they are basically the victim. They weren't somebody who was naturally violent. It was just that they were pushed to a point by the ex-partner and they just snapped, and so on and so forth. So they create and cultivate a tale where, even though they admit the violence has been there, they blame and project the reasons for that violence onto their exes. And of course, initially in the honeymoon phase, when you get together with somebody, violence tends not to feature. So this confirms the bias that the new partner is believing. Oh, it's different with me. This person wouldn't do that to me. And then bang, it happens. But by then you're invested. By then you might be living with them. By then your kids might like your partner. And you are suddenly in this situation where it's so much more complex than it would have been at the get-go if you thought, this person's violent, I'm going to stay away, I'm not going to take a chance. But unfortunately, Price takes a chance. I would say his children did actually like her, but the problems start to become very clear. And by 1998, one of the things that Knight and Price are constantly fighting over is that he doesn't want to marry her. He's already been married. It's failed. He probably doesn't want the issues of potential divorce. He could be scarred by that. And so he wants to be with Katherine Knight, but he doesn't actually want to commit to marriage. And it's interesting that Katherine Knight constantly wants to get married. She's done this before. She's pushed for marriage in prior relationships. And whether she sees that as a confirmation of commitment, whether she sees that as a legal requirement to solidify their relationship and make her feel more safe in the relationship, or whether it's just it's a level of control that she wants to be territorial. You are mine, legally, emotionally, psychologically, socially. All of those could play into her reasoning. Or maybe it's down to those insecure fractures that were created in her foundations as a child because of all the dysfunction and abuse that she suffered, that she believes that at least if they love me enough to marry me, this will be something that means that I feel more secure compared to my instability as a child. Now, because he won't marry her, this is what she does. She's like, well, I could just return to this question in a year's time. Like, I don't know, a well-adjusted human being may choose to do. But no, she's like, I know what I'll do. I'll videotape him stealing from his boss and I'll send the tape to his boss. So basically, he'd taken things from work. He'd taken these medical kits that he'd scavenged from the company rubbish tip. So they weren't things that were being used, they were being thrown away. But of course, in some company contracts, you literally cannot remove anything from the workplace. It doesn't matter that it was rubbish. It's considered an item that belongs to the actual employer, and therefore it is compromising that contract, and it means that you get done for gross misconduct. And that's what happens. He gets fired from his job. He'd held that job down for 17 years. He was very popular at work. He did a fantastic job. And this is how Katherine Knight repays him for being a partner who has actually been very kind to her, because he will not give her ultimately what she wants, what she demands. The consequences are so severe that she's willing to compromise their financial integrity to some degree, because obviously he earns a wage, but also ultimately she doesn't care because she wants to punish him. And to punish him is far more alluring and satisfying than it would be to allow him to just say, I love you, but I don't want to marry you. Now, he is devastated by this. Absolutely devastated. And he had good reason not to marry her, let's be honest. But the day that he gets sacked from his job, he cannot believe it. It's just a betrayal that's gone far too far, and he kicks her out that very same day. Unfortunately, Price then does return to the relationship. I would say he makes some changes, creates some boundaries. So he refuses to let her move in permanently, which is a very good thing. He's basically saying either behave or this separation that's occasional will become more permanent. But because we know how Katherine Knight responds and reacts when she feels under threat, because we know how she demands somebody to be completely committed to her, because we understand that she exaggerates and amplifies the actions of others because of her own jealousy, it's not going to work for her. So she becomes more aggressive, more violent, more volatile, and the fighting becomes very frequent. So as expected, it's not as if Knight changes her behaviour, and actually the fighting, as I said, became more frequent. One of the things that was really interesting and really good, I think, of his friends was that his friends said, look, we don't want anything to do with you whilst you are with Katherine Knight. And don't get me wrong, I'm not somebody who believes that tough love is always very effective, because I kind of think that in the darkest of moments, people need you to be more present then absent. And whilst I can completely comprehend why friends would say, listen, we can't be around this woman, we can't see the way that she's treating you and not react by having some boundaries, at the same time it can be counterproductive because it isolates the individual more. But I do have respect for the fact that these individuals are saying it as it is. They're telling him, this woman is bad news, this woman is dangerous. I wish they hadn't removed support, but I understand why they did. So things are not looking good for this relationship, and they're certainly not looking good for John Price, because realistically he has placed boundaries on Katherine Knight that she does not appreciate, and she believes he has broken trust with her by essentially stopping her living with him full time, and she will be amplifying all these ideas about him possibly being unfaithful. That's how their relationship started. So ultimately she's probably gravitating towards believing that these stories she's making up in her mind are real, and that puts him in danger. We get to February 2000. At this point, there's been a series of assaults on Price. And actually, it culminates in him getting stabbed in the chest, which is terrifying, because she could have killed him. So on the 29th of February 2000, he ends up taking out a restraining order, which is very good sense. This is at Scones Magistrates Court, and it's in an attempt basically to keep her away from himself and also to keep her away from his kids. And it's that very afternoon that Price actually tells co-workers if he doesn't come to work the next day, it will be because Knight murdered him. So he knows there is this potential. I imagine that even though he's saying that, he's not truly believing that it will happen, because even though she's been very violent to him, he hasn't died so far. So I imagine he thinks that she wouldn't go that far. But as I've said, the injuries he's sustained already could have killed him. So he's misrepresenting reality in that moment. Now his friends and co-workers at work plead with him, don't go home, because they know she knows where he lives. She's got this capacity for harm. And he feels that he doesn't actually have a chance because he has to go back. His children are there. If he doesn't return, his biggest fear is his kids will be there and she'll harm them. So he prioritises, as any good father would prioritise, his children's needs over his own, which is a terrible mistake with respect. So he arrives home and he actually finds out that Katherine Knight has sent the children away for a sleepover at a friend's house. So at this point, he realises that they're going to be alone. Now, she isn't there at this moment in time. So he decides to go and spend an evening with neighbours, and he actually gets back home around 11 p.m. and he goes to bed. So it's been a relatively uneventful evening. Kids are apparently safe and she isn't around. But of course, there is that saying, the lull before the storm. And my God, what a storm this is going to be. Because no matter how Price is feeling about his relationship with Katherine Knight, no matter how scared he is of the propensity that she has for violence, I do not believe even for a millisecond he truly knew the human being that he'd been sharing his life with and the true extent of the evil that she could bestow on him. Now, at some point after this, Katherine Knight arrives at John Price's house. He's sleeping at this moment in time. She has a shower. Then she wakes him up and they have sex. Then he falls asleep. And I imagine that was his best outcome. That first of all, he's had a nice evening with his neighbours, his kids are safe. She's come back. She's not angry. She actually wants to be intimate with him. But that's not the plan at all. In fact, if ever somebody was trying to lull somebody into a false sense of security, Katherine Knight had done that with John Price. On the 1st of March 2000, at 6 a.m, there's a neighbour who notices that John Price's car is still in the driveway, and they feel afraid straight away. Then he doesn't arrive at work, and his employer and his colleagues know what he'd said the day before about if he didn't come to work, something awful could have befallen him. Both the neighbour and the worker who arrives to check on John Price knocks on Price's bedroom window, trying to wake him. But they can't. And then terrifyingly, they notice blood on the front door. The police arrive quickly. They break down the back door. And at this point, they find John Price's body. And Katherine Knight is present. She's in a comatose state from taking a very large number of sleeping pills, so the intention at that point is she's going to also die. She stabbed John Price with a butcher's knife whilst he'd been sleeping. He would have been completely unaware of the unprovoked attack that was going to occur. Also, it's clear that first he was attacked on his torso when he's lying down because of the nature of the wounds. And according to the blood evidence, it seems that John Price did awake and he tried to turn the light on before just desperately trying to escape. But Katherine Knight was chasing him through the house. Can you imagine how horrifying that would be, knowing that she'd finally snapped and that the capacity that you believed lay latent within her to actually kill you was finally active? Turns out that John Price had managed to open the front door. He'd managed to get outside, but he either stumbled back inside because of his injuries or she dragged him back into the hallway. That's where he finally died, after bleeding out. He lost a hell of a lot of blood. Was found splattered and smeared literally throughout various parts of the house. There was a pool of blood that was found in the hallway. It measured 1 metre by 2 metres. That's likely in the position where he died. The autopsy also revealed that he'd been stabbed at least 37 times in both the front and the back of the body. Many of his wounds were so deep and extended all the way into his vital organs. This included the aorta, both lungs, the liver, the stomach, the descending colon, the pancreas, and his left kidney. So several hours after she had done this to this poor man, it's not as if she's finished. Katherine Knight hasn't satiated the desire that she has to let her rage be known and seen by everyone else. There is something that she wants to leave others to witness. Maybe the betrayal that she had built up in her head about John Price had become such a caricature, such an exaggerated reality for her, that she needed others to know just how angry she was. She drags his body from the hallway into the lounge. That's where his body had been found. Then she skins his body in skilled, expert style. His face, nose, ears, neck, torso, genitals, and his legs were literally removed in one to form this singular pelt. And the skin had been removed so well, so effectively, that it could literally be sewed back onto Price's body before his funeral. But that's not enough for Katherine Knight. She then decapitates him and cooks part of his body, and she serves it with baked potato, carrot, pumpkin, beetroot, cabbage, courgette, and gravy. And at the dinner table, in 2 settings, plates were left full of that food, along with notes beside each plate. Each had a name and one of Price's children on it. Now, there was actually a third meal that they found, but that had been thrown on the grass in the back garden. They don't know why, but it's speculated that Katherine Knight had attempted to eat it, but just couldn't. This would obviously mean that the rage was so enormous, so overwhelming, that she literally was consumed by it and wished to consume the individual who had literally caused it in her mind. In this case, John Price. The reason that we can only speculate about what she intended to do with that food and why it ended up thrown in the garden is because she actually claims to have no memory of the crime at all. So she cannot articulate what was actually happening, apparently. John Price's head was disturbingly actually found in a pot with vegetables, and the pot was still warm. They estimated that it was between 40 to 50 degrees, and that indicated that the actual cooking of his body had taken place in the early morning hours. Sometime after that, Katherine Knight arranged his body with the left arm draped over an empty 1.25 litre bottle of a soft drink. She crossed his legs, and it was claimed in court, in fact by the prosecution, to be an act of defilement, just demonstrating the absolute contempt that Katherine Knight had for John Price. Poor John Price. This man who'd done absolutely nothing wrong. This man who believed that his life could be in danger, but could never have imagined what would eventually happen to him in those final moments. Knight had actually left a handwritten note on top of a photograph of John Price, and it was bloodstained, and it was even covered with small pieces of flesh on it, and it read something that was completely untrue, by the way, and I'm gonna say it as it was written. Time got you back, Jonathan, for wrapping my daughter. You to Beck for Ross, for Little John, now play with Little John's dick, John Price. So she's suggesting, by the way, if you're trying to figure out what that is, and I had to go and look at what that actually meant, she's accusing him of molesting the children, of molesting her daughter. It's completely baseless, it's groundless, but the point is she's utilising that as the excuse for her actions. Now, initially, when it comes to the court case, the initial offer is that she's going to plead guilty to manslaughter. And unsurprisingly, the prosecution are like, sorry, why would we accept a plea for manslaughter? Oh, well, she didn't mean to do it. It was just one of those awful situations. She didn't actually mean to kill him. Like, honestly, as a defence, that's the most ridiculous thing that I've ever heard. I mean, genuinely, she didn't intend to kill him. Honestly, she didn't. She has no memory of it. She skinned him. Then she cooked his head. Then she was serving that to his kids. That is not something that just happens in the moment. It sounds as if that makes sense, but what we're saying is it wasn't intentional. She used her butcher's knife. We know all that. We're just saying, and if we say it enough, that it wasn't intentional, that we're hoping that in the end you'll go, it wasn't intentional. We're just going to leave it and go to court because we're not accepting under any paradigm or universe that it wasn't intentional. She literally took his skin off in one piece, which is executed very efficiently, but not appropriately, because this was John Price, a loved, priceless human being. Anyway, that's what they want to do. Anyway, she gets charged on 2nd of March 2001 with murdering Price. Absolutely, John Price deserves that because he did nothing wrong and he should never have found himself in that horrific position, particularly on the fact that he was going home to protect his children. She enters a plea, of course, of not guilty. Unbelievable. They initially fixed the trial for the 23rd of July 2001. Then they have to refix it for the 15th of October 2001 because a counsel gets ill. So obviously she needs representation. So that gets put back. Justice Barry O'Keefe, he offered the 60 jury prospects the option of being excused because of the nature of the horrific photographic evidence that they're going to have to look at. 5 removed themselves. And I think it was so professional of that judge to do that because some of those individuals, if you don't have the stomach for trauma, then it could literally ruin your life seeing pictures like that. It could absolutely cause a highly traumatic reaction. And it turns out that there were another several of those jurors that did drop out, as well as those initial 5. So then they had to select more jurors. Now, Knight's own attorney spoke to the judge at this point, and the case was adjourned to the following day. So there were obviously some musings about what was going to happen, what was going to change, because clearly they're ready to get this party started as far as a court case goes. But the attorneys are saying, can we just hang fire? So you get an idea that there were some questions and concerns about moving forward. And unsurprisingly, as far as I'm concerned, the next morning, Katherine Knight had decided to, I don't know, just change her plea to guilty because there was no way she was ever going to get found anything other than guilty. The amount of premeditation and planning that was required, whether that's going out and shopping for all the vegetables that she used to serve his kids, whether that's being prepared with the knives, whether that's the care, consideration and time it took to actually remove his skin, the posing of his body, there's no way, not a cat in hell's chance, she is walking away with anything other than a murder conviction. It's as simple as that. At this point, they adjourn the trial. They order psychiatric assessment overnight because they want to know if Katherine Knight, who up until this point has said she's not guilty, suddenly changed her opinion. They want to be absolutely 100% aware that she's compos mentis, that she understands the consequences of that guilty plea, and that she's also in a mental state where she can make such a plea. Now, Katherine Knight's legal team, they'd planned to defend her basically by claiming amnesia, by claiming disassociation. So she didn't remember anything and she wasn't in her right mind when she killed him. She was in a disassociated state. No doubt they were looking at linking that to the childhood abuse, but it wasn't accepted by the judge. They said that Katherine Knight was able to remember in vivid details events that had actually happened before John Price's death. So when she was admitted to hospital, she was able to give details of the medication that she'd taken. She was able to give evidence of the amount she'd actually overdosed with. Now, I might not be a medical professional. I might not be aware of how amnesia works, but I would hazard a guess that you don't get to remember specific details literally the minutes after you've carried out a horrific crime and the planning of having those particular tablets available to you before you carry out the crime, but that you just forget the crime. I'm imagining that's not going to wash very effectively with anyone. So again, Katherine Knight showing her incredibly manipulative ability. The very fact that she thinks that she can be like, yeah, I totally remember every single thing that I took personally, and that I did arrive with those particular tablets, and then I did take this amount specifically of those tablets, but everything in between, everything basically relating to my guilt, yeah, I've forgotten all of it. It's called convenient perpetrator amnesia. Quite a few cases I've covered, they seem to have that. So maybe it is a common theme with particular violent abusers that, you know, they are genuinely unable to remember any of the bad things that they've done. Now, two psychiatrists, they actually concluded that she had borderline personality disorder. Annoys me. Of course, she probably did have borderline personality disorder because it is linked to trauma. And when you're a child and you can't regulate your safety and you have a horrible environment and you're violently abused, of course, you are not going to have the same stability as you would if you'd had a lovely life. And you might have more extreme reactions, but that does not make you a killer under any circumstance and situation. And when they throw in BPD, it just adds to the stigma for people who suffer from it. People who suffer from BPD are more likely to harm themselves, not to harm other people. But yeah, I imagine that Katherine Knight probably did have borderline personality disorder. Where's the antisocial personality disorder, though, that we all expect to see? Because this woman is a cold-blooded psychopath every single day of the week. Now, they never gave a reason as to why she changed her plea. I would say because she's guilty as hell and knew it. That would be why. And the defence were probably scrabbling around going, listen, Katherine, we're just not going to get a good result. Maybe just admit and hope that you get some reduction of sentence. But who am I to know whether that was the case? But even though she did change to a guilty plea, the defence said that Katherine Knight still refused to accept responsibility for her actions. So she's saying she's guilty. She's accepting there's enough weight of evidence to make her be sentenced appropriately for that. But she's saying, yeah, but I didn't take any responsibility for what I actually did because at the end of the day, I didn't know what I was doing. Now, during the actual sentencing hearing, Knight's lawyers actually requested that she be excused from hearing some of the facts, so not to be present for that particular sentencing. But the application was refused. And I guess that it was refused because the judge thought, you did the crime. You're going to have to listen to the information that other people have to live with. Like John Price's children have to know what she did. Why should she get excused from hearing the horror, what she inflicted on others and what she inflicted when she stole the life of John Price? Now, when Timothy Lyons, who was the medical examiner, actually took to the stand and described in detail the skinning and the decapitation of Price, Katherine Knight became hysterical. She even had to be sedated. So that lends the question, did she remember? Was she aware? Because obviously the hysteria and the requiring sedation could make you look in and say to yourself, well, maybe she wasn't in her right mind. Maybe she was somebody who disassociated. But again, the level of premeditation that we've seen, it doesn't ring true for me. It really doesn't. The same with the amnesia. It's very convenient. And if Knight wants to control a situation, particularly if she didn't want to be in that court, then the quickest way to get yourself out of that is to become hysterical and become uncontained in your emotional ability and have people feel that they need to do something to aid that situation of circumstance, which is to sedate her and remove her. Was that not premeditated as opposed to the murder not being premeditated? Now, that's one of the questions that has been the focus of the trial since she actually changed her plea to guilty. Because essentially, some people question whether it was premeditated. But 16 months before she actually murdered John Price, she told her daughter Natasha, if I kill Pricey, I'll kill myself after it. Well, that's what she does. She tries to kill herself with an overdose after killing him. Also, 5 months before the murder, Katherine Knight's niece, Tracy Knight, actually overheard a conversation between Katherine Knight and her brother Kenneth saying, I'm going to kill Pricey and I'm going to get away with it. I'll get away with it because I'll make out I'm mad. So that fits with exactly what played out in this situation. Is it that not only is she somebody who premeditated a murder, but she's a cold, calculating, psychopathic killer who's building a narrative to ensure that as far as she's concerned, she'll get away with it. After all, she nearly killed her own baby, and she got away with that. And Katherine Knight even said to John Price, in the presence of his friend, Trevor Lewis, you'll never get me out of this house. I'll do you in first. So everyone has got evidence in his close network that leads them to believe that she had planned this for a period of time. In fact, John Price even spoke to his friend Lewis and said that he believed that Katherine would one day end up killing him, and my God, was he sadly right. And on top of his social network and his family network, his actual employers also gave evidence that suggested that the attack on him was premeditated. So Price had spoken to his employer on the 28th of February 2000, saying that he'd woken up in the really early hours of the morning to find Katherine Knight at the end of his bed with her hands behind her back, and he believed that she was holding a knife. Now, he'd leapt out of bed at that moment and he escaped, but he didn't physically leave the house because, again, he was terrified that if he did, she'd target his children. So he was living with this constant fear of that potential. Now, on the 29th of February, she actually got a video camera, which was from her twin sister's house. And she even recorded a message for her daughter, Natasha, saying, I love all my children and I hope to see them again. That reaffirms that statement that she had this intention to murder John Price and then to kill herself. And forensic psychiatrists and medical witnesses, they all agreed that Knight had determined, at least by Sunday the 27th of February 2000, that she was going to kill John Price, that she planned the method of his execution between then and between the time that she actually returned to his home on the night of the 29th of February 2000. So they were all in agreement. This was absolutely 100% horrifyingly premeditated. We get to the 8th of November, and this is where we have the outcome, where Justice O'Keefe points out that the nature of the crime and Katherine Knight's absolute lack of remorse required the most severe of penalties. He sentenced her to life imprisonment. He refused to fix a non-parole period, and instead he ordered on the papers that they must be marked definitely never to be released. That is the first time that this has ever been imposed on a woman in Australian history. It's very rare in the UK. We only have Joanna Dennehy, Rose West, and now Lucy Letby, a recent individual who's been sent to prison for killing babies. They are the only 3 women in the UK currently serving a full life tariff. They take these things very seriously and they rarely have this happen. Now, of John Price, the judge said this: the last minutes of his life must have been a time of abject terror for him, as they were a time of utter enjoyment for her. Amen to that summing up. Powerful, very true, and speaks to the psychopathic nature of this woman, as opposed to the mental instability that she was trying to project. In June 2006, Katherine Knight actually appealed that life sentence. She claimed that the penalty of life without the possibility of parole was too severe for the killing. Apparently, what she added to that was that the mutilation of John Price's body after his death was irrelevant to the crime. So her argument is, oh yeah, I did stab him to death mercilessly in a premeditated fashion, but at the end of the day, he was dead. So what I did after that really doesn't matter. The fact I skinned him and I cooked his head after decapitating him and was potentially going to serve him to his kids. You know, at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter because, you know, he was already dead and the way I killed him wasn't as bad as how other people have been killed at times. That's the logic that is so illogical. It's pretty unbelievable. The fact that there is a mismatch between understanding the level of barbarity, the level of destruction of a corpse, the level of humiliation of a corpse, and the impacts on the victim, albeit that they're dead, and those who love that victim, the fact that it's almost impossible for them to connect the impact, both where the defence puts this forward and, of course, where Katherine Knight believes that this is a reality, it's just so incongruent with humanity. It's so incongruent with of course she deserves to remain in prison for the rest of her natural life because she has shown a consistent violence in her nature, and she's lucky she hasn't killed people before because she's certainly given it a good shot. When it comes down to John Price, it is the derision of him and his humanity and the dehumanization of who he was and who he meant to people. That is why it's so severe when it comes down to the sentencing. Now, Justices Peter McCullen, Michael Adams and Megan Latham, they were the ones who looked at the appeal and they dismissed it immediately. So this was in the South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal in September that year, and Justice McCullen actually wrote in his judgment, this was an appalling crime, almost beyond contemplation in a civilised society. She currently resides in Silverwater Women's Correctional Centre in New South Wales, Australia. This is a maximum security prison, as you would expect, and it's actually home to some of Australia's most violent offenders. She's aged 67 right now, and Katherine Knight, to this day, has never expressed any sense of regret. In fact, I believe that Katherine Knight sees herself as the victim in this situation, which is as far away from truth as could ever potentially be. I'd love to know your thoughts on this case. It is harrowing beyond belief that someone can act in such a manner. And as well, it's very unusual for women to do this and act this way. We don't see it anywhere near as often as we do male to female violence. But she is a high level perpetrator, cold-blooded in every single way. I would love to know your thoughts. Do you feel that her childhood certainly formed her? Do you feel that the rage that she felt because of her lack of power as a child is something that's been projected into the adult woman that she grew into, and the rage towards men became so amplified because of those experiences early on? Or do you believe that actually she has a fracture in her foundation where she is just a cold-blooded psychopathic killer and she was always going to do the things that we've talked about today? Let me know. As ever, I appreciate every single one of your comments. I hope that you've learned something new about this case. If not, feel free to let me know that. And if you have any more information, I would love to hear from you guys. Take care. Join me again next time. Be safe, guys.